Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my usual podcast partner, Bob Duff. And this is the HockeyDebates.com podcast. We come to you twice a week to talk all things hockey, even during a pandemic. But finally, Bob, we have a lot to talk about. And before we get going, start us out there with.
Well, it's a big week for hockey, and it's a big week for the Hockey Debates podcast. We've got Stanley Cup hockey back to talk about, and we've also got a sponsor to talk about. The Hockey Debates podcast is brought to you by SportsBettingDime.com, your leading source for odds, sports news, and game predictions. If you're looking to see who's the favorite to win the Stanley Cup, the Hart Trophy, or who's going to win a specific series, check out all the info at sportsbettingdime.com. We'll be talking about some of their Stanley Cup odds today, and we'll also leave a link in the description of this episode so you can check them out yourselves. Kevin, why don't you introduce today's guest?
I will. Our guest is Matt Vensel, who is the beat writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and of course he covers the Penguins. And boy, I think this is perfect time to talk about the Penguins because after Game 1, Matt, I think of everyone in Pittsburgh's greatest fear realized as they watched Carey Price deliver the goods and perform at a high level. And, of course, the Penguins went down. But I think everyone had to breathe a sigh of relief because, you know, and I watched that Game 2 when it was over, even though it was a tight game, I felt, you know, the Penguins are back in control. That's how it felt to me. Like they needed to well, obviously it was an important game, but I think once they won Game 2, I think they felt like, okay, we're right back where we should be in this series.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, sometimes we can make things way more complicated than it needs to be, but no doubt in Game 1, Carey Price was the difference. Goaltending in general, not that Matt Murray was bad, but Carey Price is great. And I do think it was interesting that Mike Sullivan kept the entire lineup intact, stuck with Matt Murray after that game. You know, he basically said, look, let's not panic. Let's remain patient here. We did a lot of good things, and let's just roll it back. And it ended up paying off in a lot of ways, you know, starting with Matt Murray. And, you know, the Penguins, they got a bunch of chances early in both games, and they kept plugging away. I think the difference in this one was they were a lot tighter defensively. Murray was better with his rebound control, and they just played a little bit more of that playoff style of hockey where maybe they were a little loose in that first game.
Well, so much is made of Malkin and Crosby, and certainly they're a huge part of the Penguins. But they're also a team that has so much more, and we kind of saw evidence of that in Game 2. You get a goal from Zucker, you get a goal from Gensel. The Penguins just seem to have so many scoring options that Montreal just doesn't have, and you think in the long run that's just going to make the difference.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest X factor beyond maybe Sidney Crosby's health is the third line. I mean, you said it. They're able to roll out two really good lines. The Penguins got Jake Gensel back because of everything they were dealing with in a pandemic, and suddenly they were able to bump down Jason Zucker to play with Brian Rust and Malkin. They got a really good checking line and a fourth line centered by Teddy Bluger, but it's that third line that's really going to be an X factor as they figure that out. But, you know, if they can find the right combination there, they'd be able to roll out four really good lines, and I think that would make them a real problem if they're able to get past the Canadiens.
Matt, when I talk to retired players, always one of the conversations that comes up is the lost opportunities that each player had to win the cup. And almost every player can identify a season when they felt, you know, they had enough talent to win it all, and then something went wrong or they didn't perform at a high enough level. I sense the Penguins understand that this is one of those kind of teams that, you know, Malkin and Crosby are getting older. And this team has enough to win it all. Do you think they feel that way, or am I misreading that?
I think you absolutely nailed it. You know, we don't know how many chances these guys are going to have, but this might be the best chance they have left. You know, they really look like a special team midway through the year when they were without Crosby and they dealt with other injuries. And, you know, some of these games that they won, I mean, they would, you know, come back from 3 goals down. They would blow a 3-goal lead and still win. There was a game in Colorado where Matt Murray let in a goal from center, and they fought back and won. I mean, they just were so resilient. They were kind of like a horror movie villain. And for whatever reason, they, you know, in the sense that they just get up and keep coming. And for whatever reason, they kind of hit a lull right before the pause. But, you know, I think this time should have put it in perspective if it wasn't already, that this is a really good team, a really deep team. They're benefiting from getting Gensel back and some of these guys healthy. Their blue line is pretty deep. I know the third pairing's a worry and goaltending's a question mark, but you're right. They have everything they need to win a cup. And I do think there's a sense that they shouldn't take this opportunity for granted, because for Crosby and Malkin and Letang, who are all in 33, 34, there's no guarantee that they'll have another team as good as this one.
No, the old cliche about being the Rodney Dangerfield is an overworked one in sports, but certainly when you look at the Canadiens, they probably fit that description as well as anybody. I mean, currently in the SBD Stanley Cup tracker, they're the plus 8,000 long shot to win the cup. And on the flip side, they're the plus 1,000 favorite to win the draft lottery. So no one's expecting Montreal to hang around long. You've had a good look at them the last couple of games. What do you see that they can do that gives Pittsburgh trouble?
I thought this was going to be a series that went the distance. Montreal has a lot of speed. Carey Price, when he's on, is really good. But I also think there's a couple factors in play. One, the long layoff, it kind of just adds a lot of uncertainty to everything. I mean, I think this is going to be a wild playoffs. We're already kind of seeing it already. And I also think in a sense the Canadiens, for the reasons you just mentioned, the fact that they weren't supposed to be here. Some people in Montreal are saying they should not even try and get Lafreniere. I think they are kind of playing with house money in a sense. So, we were just talking about everything the Penguins have at stake. On the flip side, you have a younger, mostly Canadiens team that has been playing, really loose. So I think that was a recipe for the Penguins to potentially give them a challenge, especially if they had some kinks early on in the series. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if this won 5 games. I still expect the Penguins to win, but I think the Canadiens are up for the challenge if Carey Price keeps doing what he's doing.
Matt, we always judge coaches obviously by championships, but within that, we also judge them, as how good of a bench coach are they, how good of a communicator, how good of a strategist they are. But I've always felt it's important to know what to say at the right time publicly. And after game 1, I found it interesting that Sullivan decided it was time to defend Schultz and Johnson. Why do you think he decided to do that at that point?
Well, no one is scrutinized more than Jack Johnson here in Pittsburgh. And that's saying something, because Matt Murray's here and people scrutinize him so much because he's not Marc-Andre Fleury. So, I think it's been 2 years that he's had to stand up for Jack Johnson. And also, I think he also knows that the team does have a lot riding on that pair there. I know he pointed to forwards being a little aggressive, tracking back on those goals, which to a degree, yeah, that was part of the problem. But I think in a way he was just trying to take a little bit of the pressure off those guys. And I think the fact that he stood with Jack Johnson, didn't sub him out, sent a message to the rest of the team that we feel good about the group we've got. And honestly, that pair was really good in game 2. They matched up well with Montreal speed. I don't think they allowed a single high danger chance according to natural stat tricks. So they delivered. I mean, they weren't playing a ton at 5-on-5 because of all the penalties, but if those guys are going to play 12, 14 minutes a night, they just kind of have to tread water for this team to have a chance.
So Kevin and I kind of touched on this last week on the podcast about all the time these coaches have had to prepare. They've pretty much known for 2 months what team they were going to play in the playoffs, which is unprecedented in terms of preparation time. And I always figure the worst thing a coach can have is time on their hands, because then they tend to overanalyze, they overthink things. And I remember the old Bum Phillips, who's well known in Pittsburgh from his days coaching the Houston Oilers against the Steelers. His had a famous saying, "You dance with who brung you." And I think that's credit to Mike Sullivan. He didn't overthink this. He went with the guys that he knew deliver the goods. He didn't try to think, oh, this kid could give us more speed, or maybe this kid can play better. And he went with the guys that he trusts and that have proven themselves over the years, and it certainly seems to be working.
Yeah, I mean, it's always wild after a tough loss in the playoffs to hear kind of the reaction of fans and sports talk radio and us newspaper people, how we react. I mean, everyone was clamoring for all kinds of changes after that first game. Starting in goal, get Jack Johnson out of there, play Patrick Hornquist like 60 minutes a game. They wanted all these changes. But Mike Sullivan has been thinking about what his lineup would look like for literally like 4 months. So it honestly probably would have sent a message, a little bit of panic to the team if he suddenly came out with drastic changes after they lost a game in overtime that they were the better team in. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it was the right play by him to not overreact to one loss, and to stick with these guys, because they've had a lot of time to think about what the ideal lineup looks like, and they have all the pieces, and there's some question marks, but they have a lot that they already have figured out already.
Matt, the decision to play Matt Murray just seemed like the logical one. He has won cups. He's more experienced. He's been there in this type situation, not a pandemic, but certainly the playoffs before. But the goaltending situation in Pittsburgh is so complicated. The expansion draft is coming up. You've got two good young goalies. Jim Rutherford said earlier in the summer that he may have to move one of them. Can you give us any kind of glimpse of what it's going to look like moving forward? Should we glean from this that that Matt Murray will be the goalie that's kept? Will they for sure trade one, or what's your take on what will happen with the goalies?
How much time do we got here? I mean, this is an extremely complicated situation. Actually, we had a lot of downtime during the pause. I wrote, I think, a 2,000-word story about the goalie situation in April. And yeah, it's fascinating. And I still think a lot is going to be determined in this year's playoffs. But both Matt Murray and Tristan Jarry are restricted free agents. Matt Murray has the 2 cups. Jarry was an all-star this year, something Matt Murray's never done. And, I think when the Penguins won those 2 cups with Murray, everyone just assumed that, Matt Murray was going to be just a consistent Vezina candidate, and it really hasn't happened. I mean, his save percentage is just a tick above 900 over the past 3 years. He's been hot and cold. He's dealt with some injuries. I think he's been pretty good in the playoffs. I mean, even last year's playoffs against the Islanders, I thought he was solid. So he's one of those guys, kind of like a Grant Fuhr, not comparing him to a Hall of Famer in every sense, but he's a gamer who does better in the playoffs. All that said, how much do you pay a guy if he's unable to be a go-to guy for 55 plus games? So it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. I know the Penguins at least talked to him about a contract last year, and it was just too wide of a gap. I mean, I don't know how close he's looking to Andre Vasilevsky type money, but I think the Penguins should proceed with pause, knowing that they still have leverage in their back pocket. But a lot's still going to be figured out. And yeah, it wouldn't be surprising to see the Penguins trade one of these guys. I don't know if one will leave in restricted free agency. And it also wouldn't be a surprise to see them just run it back if they can, maybe sign Murray on a 1-year deal or just keep him as a restricted free agent and kick the can down the road a little bit.
Well, one thing we know about Jim Rutherford is he's an old school GM when it comes to trades. He's not the least bit afraid to make them, whereas most of these guys tend to be so cautious about making moves in this salary cap era. He kind of operates as an old school pre-salary cap GM where he's not afraid to pull the trigger and make something happen.
Yeah, I mean, look no further than the move on from Marc-Andre Fleury. I mean, it was totally justifiable to go with the young guy who played so well in winning 2 cups. But, I mean, Marc-Andre Fleury might be as popular or close to it as Sidney Crosby here in Pittsburgh. So Jim's not afraid to, make cold, calculated moves in the best interest of his team. And yeah, it would seem crazy if you would have told me 2-3 years ago that they could move on from Matt Murray, but he's looking at the big picture, and that's maximizing the Stanley Cup window with Crosby and Malkin and Letang still playing.
Matt, pretend for a moment that you're Mike Sullivan and or Jim Rutherford. What is your biggest worry about this Penguins team in this postseason?
I would think probably consistency in terms of collective effort and doing a lot of the stuff that they were doing in December and January, things that, obviously it's a lot of hockey cliches, but, getting pucks deep or, playing together on the breakout. It's just, they were so good for whatever reason when all those guys were out at just playing smart hockey, doing the little things. And for whatever reason, when everyone came back, they weren't able to replicate it. We've seen it in spurts. I do think game 2 was a step in the right direction, but it's just them consistently playing together. I mean, instead of just kind of, trying to win with pure talent and skill and getting reckless and leading the odd man. I mean, look at the Islanders series last year. They need to play the exact opposite of that in terms of that. So I think that's the biggest worry. And just in terms of personnel, I mentioned the third line. That's a major question mark. That third pair and goaltending. But still, I think there's a lot of pieces there. I do think they have the tools they need in-house. It's just kind of figuring out the right combinations and hopefully getting good goaltending from one of these guys.
Go ahead, Bob.
The NHL odds page at SBD has the Penguins down as the -167 favorites to win Game 3. The Canadiens are the +143 long shots. If you were a betting man, Matt, which way would you be putting your money for Game 3?
I have to think the Penguins are going to take control of the series from here. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising if Montreal got one of these games at some point. But I think the signs are there for the Penguins to break through. And I look at the Malkin line. I mean, I think they've had a ton of chances in the first 2 games where they haven't been able to get through. But I could see them popping a couple goals past Carey Price in Game 3. I think they've been knocking on the door. And at that point, if you have Crosby going and Malkin going and everything else, I think, one of these games, they're going to overwhelm Price and the Canadiens, and it very well could be Game 3.
All right, Matt, we appreciate having you on. This has been Matt Vensel, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You can check him out on Twitter, of course, and going to the Post-Gazette website. Thanks for all of your insight. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Thanks a lot, Matt. See you around. All right, so what do you think? Normally we'd be talking about Pittsburgh going to Montreal for Game 3 in a best-of series, but they're not going anywhere. They're coming back on the same ice, and I got to think, I think when we, again, discussed this last week, a lot of people seem to have 2010 in their mind, that great upset the Canadiens pulled against Crosby and the Penguins in round 1, but I just don't think history's going to repeat itself a decade later. I agree with Matt. I think Pittsburgh takes control of this now.
Yeah, I felt they were in control even yesterday when it was a very tight game. And I don't know why, because it was a tight game and Carey Price was playing. It was every bit the fire-breathing dragon that the Penguins fans thought he might be. He was doing what he was supposed to do. But I just felt like the Penguins think, okay, we got this. And I wouldn't be surprised if they just went out. Matt said he thought they might win a game, but I wouldn't be shocked if the Penguins now just go boom, boom, boom and get it over. So,
well, speaking of going boom in a bad way have been the New York Rangers, the team we both thought were ready to do great things in these playoffs and maybe surprise some folks. And the only surprise has been how bad they've fared in 2 games against the Carolina Hurricanes, a team they normally dominate.
Yeah, but I think we discounted, how strong a team Carolina was. I think Carolina was sitting out the weeds in the weeds because, last year we watched them and we were so impressed by those, how well they played in getting to the conference final that, we just forgot that, they know a little bit that the culture has changed there. They know a little bit about winning, important games. And, I said going in that they didn't have anybody like Artemi Panarin, who was an MVP candidate, or even Mika Zibanejad, who had a 41-goal season. Now, statistically, they didn't have. But, they have Sebastian Aho. They have Teravainen. They've got Svechnikov. They've got a lot of talented forwards. And Panarin hasn't played like Panarin in the first 2 games, in my opinion. It's one of those cases where he was a dominant performer. And then, the season ended. He went home, and whatever he had, he lost. Now, it doesn't mean he's not going to get it back in Game 3, but, I would say the forwards that I mentioned for Carolina have played better than Panarin. And Zibanejad has been okay and fine, but, he's probably got another level as well. I think what's impressive for me about the Carolina Hurricanes is they're playing without 2 top defensemen, Hamilton and Pesce, and they're still getting the job done. And the goalie that the Red Wings thought wasn't good enough, Peter Mrazek, is just good enough to win for the Carolina Hurricanes. And it's not so different than last year. When I never thought Peter Mrazek was spectacular last year, but every game he was credible. He was good enough to give them a chance to win, and he was dependable. And I think that's what we've seen thus far in Mrazek. He's a very dependable, solid NHL goalie who gives his team a chance to win. So, it's probably more of a misread of Carolina or an undervaluing of what they bring than it was that we overestimated the Rangers. I think the Rangers are still a very good young team. But, some of their younger players, Adam Fox hasn't been as terrific as he was in the second half of the regular season either.
When we had Tom Laidlaw on a couple of weeks back, and he certainly knows the Rangers a lot better than either you or I, and he was absolutely convinced they were going to play Shesterkin in goal, and David Quinn went with the veteran Henrik Lundqvist. Were you at all surprised by that move?
Well, the word is that gosh, I'm drawing a blank here.
Shesterkin
was injured, but how injured is he? But I will say this: I don't think Lundqvist is the reason why they've lost these games. Carolina's outplayed them in the first two games, and Lundqvist was solid in his performance, but Shesterkin probably could have. There's no doubt that they see him. They being the Rangers see him as part of their future and as their guy now. So it was probably disruptive to the team chemistry to not have him back there, because I think they've already committed to that he's their guy and that Lundqvist will be elsewhere next season.
Well, on the subject of New York, we'll talk about the other New York team that's in the playoffs, the Islanders. Really intriguing series between the Islanders and the Panthers, because you got a Florida team that can really crank up the offense, and you got an Islander team that can really, shut down an offense. So Islanders got the better of the deal in game one. Are you still pretty confident they're going to be the one left standing when this is all done?
Well, no doubt. They picked up another win to run it up to 2-0, and I said before the playoffs started that they were a lot of people said the Penguins were their top lock, and I said my lock was the Islanders over the Panthers. I just have not seen anything out of the Panthers that leads me to believe that they have changed their ways. And I like the talent there. There's some talented players there. Barkov, Huberdeau. These are guys that are terrific, skillful, magical offensive players. Ekblad, Yandel, these are guys that can handle the puck. They're fun to watch. But for some reason, none of that translates into winning hockey. And everybody thought that Bobrovsky might be the key to turning it around, but that wasn't the case. Others thought it was going to be Joel Quenneville, who had the magic potion in Chicago and had everybody playing well and developing a winning culture there, but that hasn't happened either. I think people thought Quenneville would be a different guy and save them in the postseason, but not in the first two games. I just don't think the mix is right. It's not that these are terrible hockey players. They're not. They're quality hockey players. But sometimes the team requires, some glue players to kind of hold it together or, to have the right mix, and they don't seem to have that. They're not glued well together, so they're just a collection of skillful players.
And yet the odds makers seem to have a difficult time embracing the Islanders, even with the 2-0 lead. They're the -113 favorites heading into Game 3, whereas Florida is at -103. It's pretty rare to see both teams in a game with negative odds. So obviously the odds makers aren't ready to put the nails in Florida's coffin just yet.
Well, it's interesting, Bob, because when I used to go with you occasionally to the horse races, and harness racing. I tend to, I don't know anything about horse racing, but I tend to be a statistics guy. So I bet on the driver in harness racing and the jockey in thoroughbred racing. You know, I see who's won a lot, and I figure they pick winning horses, and so I bet them. Well, I don't understand, like in hockey, like why wouldn't you bet on Barry Trotz? You know, Barry Trotz, he knows a little bit about winning. You know, he's won a Stanley Cup. He took the Nashville Predators were competitive as an expansion team. They didn't win anything because, you know, that's not the way expansion used to be set up. But you know, he knows what he's doing, and I would bet on Barry Trotz having his team prepared defensively to play anyone, and he certainly has had his team ready to play the Panthers. There's no doubt about that.
Well, you mentioned fun a little while ago, and we got to talk about what I think has been the most fun series to watch in terms of entertainment value, and that's the Edmonton Oilers and the Chicago Blackhawks. I mean, this is like those clashes the two teams had in the old Western Conference days in the 80s when it was just a shootout. We've actually got, in the sports betting dime NHL odds, we've got a total of 6.5 goals on this game, and I'd be really tempted to play the over at -112. You just don't see 6.5 goals as a total in an NHL game. I mean, we're talking Gretzky and Lemieux era when those totals would be up there. You don't see those today. So, I mean, this is kind of like, you know, making you want to get your Bengals records out and throw a Miami Vice DVD in and watch, you know, it's 80s night.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be tempted. I think we should, you know, throw together a sawbuck and do that, because I agree with you. You know, watching Patrick Kane, you know, play, and Jonathan Taves, and you know, both of those seem to be drinking at the fountain of youth because they've looked very good in these couple of games. But you know, the problem is, I think Game 2 was an indication, and I thought this game after Game 1. You know, the Blackhawks are not going to go score 6 goals a game, and it's pretty clear the Oilers are going to score 4 or 5 in every game. I don't think that Blackhawks have a defense to stop, you know, Connor McDavid and Draisaitl in the game. You know, I just think they're not sort of ready for this. But they've played spirited hockey, and I agree with you. It's been a fun series to watch, and I think it'll still be high scoring because, you know, the Oilers really haven't been as mindful of defensive play as they need to be, you know, if they're going to be successful. I was kind of hoping they would be able to clamp down. You know, thinking back to the 80s, one of the things that was always lost about the Oilers, you know, they could score 1 billion goals, but at playoff time in the 80s, they played a little bit differently. Like, they understood that you had to prevent the other team from scoring, and they had guys that could do that. And, you know, they could play a more defensive style. And I was hoping that because Wayne Gretzky walks around there now, that you know, he might have reminded the boys that, you know, in playoffs we got to play a little bit differently. But thus far, we haven't seen that.
I always admired those early 80s Blackhawks teams because even though they knew the potency of the Oilers' attack, they said, the heck with it. It was like getting in the ring with Mike Tyson and deciding, you know what, let's just trade haymakers. You knew that was a philosophy for instant disaster, and yet Chicago would get in there and trade chances with the Oilers, and they had some of the highest scoring Stanley Cup games we've ever seen. But it wasn't a way that Chicago was going to win the series, but it sure was fun to watch. Yeah,
I was there for that big playoff game where Mark Messier took charge. And in the old Chicago Stadium, and then lead the next day in the Chicago Tribune, because I'm pretty sure Mark Messier set a new NHL record, breaking Gordie Howe's old record for the number of people cut during a single NHL game. And the next day, you know, Kylie was the writer for the Chicago Tribune, and I don't remember the exact lead, but it had made reference to the fact of Mark Messier being a pumpkin carver. That he had carved some pumpkins the night before. So I will never forget that. And, you know, of course, Messier had a couple of goals and assists, and, 3 or 4 players cut. I remember somebody said he cut 2 on one shift. So I don't know if that was true, but I don't remember. It might have been an exaggeration, but he certainly did, play a memorable game, both offensively and defensively and physically.
As Matt pointed out after Pittsburgh lost Game 1, how quickly everyone is to overreact in the playoffs. Well, we certainly saw that after the Oilers lost Game 1. There were so many people ready to throw Connor McDavid under the bus, and then he just put the bus in gear in Game 2 and drove it right over the Blackhawks.
He did. Well, that's the thing about Connor McDavid. He's got 4 goals in 2 games, and everybody said he was terrible in Game 1. Everyone should draft players to be so horrible, that to have such a poor game and still have 4 goals after 2 games. So, No, I've said before the playoffs, I think it would be good for the league if McDavid has an extended run, and I still feel that way. But as usual, the time has gone too quickly, and we'll be back later in the week to talk about these exciting NHL playoffs. And are we going to have a guest from?
I believe we're going to have an SBD expert come on and analyze the odds for us on Thursday.
Sounds good. We'll be talking about the competition like we always do. We'll just be telling you in terms of the betting odds as well. So it'll still seem like we had today.
Yeah, and if you can't wait for us to tell you about the odds, don't forget sportsbettingdime.com. They've got them all right there. Just click on it, and you've got more NHL bets than you could ever imagine. And everybody, you have a great day, and we'll see you in a couple days.